Whenever you're confronted with hardship, with adversity, you have to ask yourself a real important question. Do you intend to overcome this? Do you intend to survive it? And then the follow-up question has to be, how far are you willing to go to overcome it? I had a moment very early in my incarceration whenever I was being transported to the prison where I would serve my time, when one officer made a joke to another within my hearing. That guy over there, referring to me, he's obviously not going to make it. He won't last a year. I resolved at that moment that whatever it took, I was going to make it home to my family. I was going to survive. Whatever it takes is such a big sentence. People say it, but you have to stop and ask yourself, what do you actually mean by that? If you have to lie to survive, cheat, steal, what if the riot kicks off and there's some angry man coming at you with a knife? Will you kill to survive if it's him or you? It's a slippery slope whenever you start saying, better me than the next guy, I'll do what I have to. And you can lose yourself very easily. Once I arrived at High Desert, it became very clear that the key to surviving was going to be to stay off the yard. The yard was where the violence happened, or at least it was where the decision for violence happened. If you weren't there, you were unlikely to be involved. The first year I was incarcerated, this was relatively easy. I was on a probationary period called Close A Custody. What this means is that I was allowed to interact with the other inmates to a far more limited degree than most any other inmate. Everybody else would be allowed to go out and play cards or go to the yard and do push-ups, and I would have to stay in my cell because the cops had me on this probationary period. At the end of a year, they evaluated my case and determined that I didn't need to be moved to a more secure facility and that I would be allowed to be placed on Close B custody. This was good in that they were acknowledging that I was programming, that I wasn't doing wrong, that I wasn't hurting anybody. But it was bad in that I was now going to be around the other inmates day in and day out all day long. You don't have the option of just coming out and saying, hey fellas, I don't want to get involved in any crimes, and I realized y'all are a bunch of violent sociopaths, so I'm just going to stay inside today. Mandatory yard, I've said that before and they mean it, it's a rule. But there are exceptions to that rule, same as any rule. For instance, if you have an appeal, you're allowed to go to the law library and work on your court case every once in a while, and you better believe I used that excuse. But you can only use that once a week or so is how often you'll be allowed to go to the law library. Similarly, if you have a medical complaint, you need a tooth drilled, or you need your temperature taken by the nurses, you're allowed to go to medical rather than be on the yard. But again, this is not something you can consistently use convincingly. What I needed was a job. If you have a job, you don't have to be out on the yard. You're allowed to go to your job. And this is because if you refuse to go to your job, you lose your yard privileges anyway. So both the inmates and the staff would rather that you went to your job and then did your recreational yard time whenever you weren't supposed to be at your job. The problem was that High Desert had inmates that were serving incredible amounts of time. Life sentences, 20, 30, 50 years. The conventional wisdom was that if you waited for 3 or 4 years, they would eventually get to you and give you a job. But until you'd been there that long, you should just assume the jobs were going to go to other people who had been waiting that long. I couldn't wait 3 or 4 years. It was a foregone conclusion that I'd be involved in some violent incident in that time period if I was out on the yard every single day. So I pulled out the rule book, and I started really getting into all of the minutiae of the regulations of CDC to try and find some way to get myself a job. What I discovered was that there had been a court case where it had been determined that inmates must be afforded the opportunity to read and write if they didn't already know how. There's a test called the TABE test that they administer to every inmate. And if it was determined that you had a TABE score of below 4.0, meaning that you had a 4th grade education or lower, then they had to put you at the top of the waiting list to learn to read and write to go to school. Because if you can't read and write, you can't avail yourself of the other rights that the court provides to you. You can't utilize your due process. Essentially, all of your rights extend from literacy. So, I requested to take the TABE test, and I put an incredible amount of effort into flunking that thing brutally. Had I scored below a 3rd grade education, they would have done follow-up testing to determine if I was developmentally disabled. Had I scored above 4th grade, they would have said that that's good enough for an inmate. 4th grade is how well you have to be able to read and write in order to be an inmate in CDC. I managed to score 3.3 on my TABE, meaning that I was about halfway between a 3rd grader and a 4th grader in reading ability. And CDC was kind enough to issue me a lovely chrono stating that that was the level to which I was able to read and write. I was then placed into education, Mr. Schumacher's class. I had a dilemma once I was placed in education. First, I obviously didn't belong. You can pretend to not know how to read and write for a short period of time, but to do it day in and day out would A, be incredibly disingenuous, and B, I don't know that you could convincingly do it long term. That is an incredible amount of falsehood to stack upon falsehood. Thankfully, Teacher Schumacher was a pretty cool guy. In fact, in my experience, most of the people who chose to teach in prison, they're decent people and they really do want to help. Once he realized that I didn't exactly belong in his class, he offered me with 2 possibilities. He said that I could take a test and be out of his class in a week, or I could stay in the class and operate as a teacher's aide. I could help the other people who were having difficulty learning to read and write do so. I could hand out tests, I could grade tests. This was a great opportunity for me, and I really enjoyed the teaching aspect. And in fact, often throughout the remainder of my term, I would set up a little placard offering to teach people who wanted to read and write or take correspondence courses or anything like that. I found it very fulfilling. However, after, I think, 9 months in the education program, the administration instituted a policy, and I've often wondered if they enacted this policy specifically because of me, that people had to take regular tests in order to determine that they really belonged in the classes that they had been placed in. I didn't want to do a second round of intentionally flunking a test. I was worried that it would become clear that I was lying, and I certainly didn't want that. Thankfully, I was approached by a member of the administration, Sergeant Hoagland, who Teacher Schumacher had approached and told my dilemma. He said they needed a clerk in the program office, somebody who would type the rules violation reports that other inmates had generated, somebody who would help the officers with their paperwork. And this was a great position for me to end up in, and I immediately tested out of education and was placed into this job as a sergeant's clerk, later a lieutenant's clerk at High Desert. I said, better me than the next guy. That's a very common sentiment, and it's human. I mean, if something bad has to happen, if somebody's going to die, very few people will say, well, I'm the guy who should get killed. Especially whenever the next guy in prison is often a violent sociopath who did something truly awful to be incarcerated in the first place. But that is a slippery slope. Better me than him. It's real easy to slide down that slope and use it to justify all kinds of ill behavior. Sure, all I was doing was taking somebody's spot in education. All I did was cheat on a test, lie on a form. But where does that slope end? I'm using some kind of moral argument that I'm more deserving than the next person at the same time that I'm sliding down the same slope they slid. Be very careful when you are confronted with a dilemma, whenever you are confronted with the opportunity to say, well, I'll move that line just a little bit, I'll slide just a little bit down that slope. You can lose yourself. I really believe the only reason that I walked out of CDC being essentially the same person as whenever I was incarcerated was because I was so aware of how easy it is to lose yourself down that slope. They call it slippery for a reason. You go down and you can't climb back up. Think very carefully, long and hard, before you move the line about what you will do, about who you want to be. Because you can lose yourself. Don't lose yourself.